Have you ever caught someone staring at you a second too long, then quickly looking away like they got caught doing something they shouldn't? Have you ever felt like the energy in the room shifted the moment someone specific walked in, but you couldn't explain why? Love doesn't announce itself with fireworks and grand confessions the way movies want you to believe. Real love, the kind that actually lasts, sneaks in quietly through tiny behavioral shifts that most people never notice because they're too busy waiting for something dramatic to happen. Psychologists who study attachment and human bonding have found that the brain reveals emotional investment long before the mouth ever does. Your nervous system leaks the truth in body language, in small inconsistencies, in the way attention behaves differently around one person compared to everyone else. And today, we're going to break down the psychology behind falling in love, using research on attachment theory, mirroring behavior, and emotional vulnerability so you can actually read what's happening beneath the surface instead of guessing. But here's the thing, there's one particular sign, one specific behavioral pattern that shows up almost universally when someone is falling for another person, and it's so subtle that most people miss it completely, even when it's happening right in front of them. Stay with me because by the end of this video, you'll never look at those small moments the same way again. Before we get to that one sign, I want you to think about something for a second. Think about the last time you felt truly comfortable around someone. So comfortable that you forgot to perform, forgot to filter yourself, forgot to worry about how you looked or sounded. That feeling, that specific kind of ease, is rarer than people think, and psychologically speaking, it's one of the first cracks in the armor that lets real affection show through. Because here's what almost nobody tells you. Falling in love isn't really about excitement. It's about safety. The nervous system doesn't fall for chaos. It falls for the person who makes it feel like it can finally exhale. And that changes everything about how you should be watching for these signs, because you're not looking for fireworks. You're looking for calm. Now, here's where it gets interesting. And this is the part I promised you. Psychologists have observed something called unconscious synchronization. And it happens automatically when two people begin forming an emotional bond, especially in the early unspoken stages before either person has said a word about their feelings. It shows up in breathing patterns, in the pace of speech, in posture, even in how quickly someone laughs after you make a joke. But we're going to slow down and unpack that properly in just a moment, because there's context you need first. Context that will completely change how you interpret every interaction going forward. Let's talk about attention first, because attention is currency, and the brain is brutally honest about where it spends that currency, even when the mouth says otherwise. Somebody can tell you they're busy, they can tell you they're distracted, they can tell you 1,000 polite excuses, but attention doesn't lie the way words do. When someone is developing feelings for you, their attention starts behaving differently in your presence compared to everyone else's presence. Researchers who study social attention have found that people orient their bodies, their eyes, and their listening focused toward the person they're emotionally invested in, even when they consciously try not to. It's called attentional bias, and it's one of the earliest markers of romantic interest that shows up in brain imaging studies. Have you ever been in a group setting and noticed that one person seems to remember every small detail you mentioned weeks later in a conversation that felt completely throwaway at the time? That's not coincidence, and it's not just good memory. Attention creates memory, and if someone's brain is prioritizing you enough to store your offhand comments, it means something in their system marked you as significant. This is one of the quiet giveaways that most people brush off because it doesn't feel dramatic enough to count as a real sign, but psychologically, it's actually one of the most reliable ones. Now let's talk about something a little more uncomfortable, something people rarely admit even to themselves. Falling in love makes people awkward before it makes them smooth. This might contradict what you've seen in movies, where the person falling in love becomes charming and confident and says all the right things. But real psychology tells a very different story. When emotional stakes rise, the brain's threat detection system, the amygdala, becomes more active because vulnerability registers as risk. This is why you'll sometimes see someone who is normally articulate suddenly stumble over their words around a person they're developing feelings for. It's why someone who's usually relaxed might seem stiff or overly careful in how they phrase things. If you've ever wondered why someone you suspected liked you seemed almost distant or overly formal at first, this might be exactly why. Their nervous system was working overtime, trying not to expose too much too fast. Here's where things start connecting to a deeper pattern, because these small individual signs, the attention, the awkwardness, the memory, none of them mean much in isolation. A person could remember a detail because they're simply attentive by nature. Someone could stumble over their words because they're nervous in general. This is exactly why so many people misread situations, why so many people convince themselves someone likes them when they don't, or worse, completely miss it when someone actually does. The real psychological truth is that falling in love isn't identified through one single behavior. It's identified through a cluster of behaviors that all point in the same direction consistently over time, specifically around you and not around other people. Let's talk about mirroring, because this is where the science gets genuinely fascinating. Mirroring is a psychological phenomenon where people unconsciously imitate the body language, tone, and even the emotional expressions of someone they feel connected to. It happens below conscious awareness, driven largely by what neuroscientists call mirror neurons, brain cells that activate both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing it. In the context of emotional bonding, mirroring shows up as someone adjusting their posture to match yours, crossing their arms when you cross yours, leaning in when you lean in, even matching the rhythm of your speech patterns. This isn't something people do on purpose. In fact, most people have no idea they're doing it at all. If you go back and think about someone who liked you, or maybe someone who currently seems interested, ask yourself if you've noticed this kind of synchronized behavior. Do they seem to naturally fall into your pace when you walk together? Do they seem to laugh at the same moments you find funny, even before you finish the joke? This kind of synchronization is one of the clearest nonverbal indicators that someone's emotional system has aligned itself with yours, and it happens specifically because the brain wants to create a sense of unity, a sense of being on the same wavelength when it starts to care about someone deeply. There's another layer to this that most relationship content completely ignores, and it has to do with what happens when things go wrong, not when things are going right. Here's the truth. Anyone can seem interested when everything is easy, when the conversation flows and the timing works out and nothing gets tested. The real psychological tell shows up during friction, during awkward silences, during moments of miscommunication or minor conflict. When someone is falling for you, they tend to repair rather than retreat. This means that after an awkward exchange, instead of pulling away completely or letting the tension sit unresolved, they'll circle back. They'll send a follow-up message. They'll bring up the topic again later just to smooth things over. They'll ask if everything's okay between you two. This behavior is rooted in something called relational investment, a psychological concept describing how much effort someone is willing to put into maintaining a connection even when it's uncomfortable to do so. People who don't care simply let things go quiet. People who are falling for someone can't stand the idea of unresolved tension with that specific person, even if they can tolerate it with almost everyone else in their life. Now, I want you to think back to a moment, maybe recently, maybe further in the past, where there was a small disagreement or awkward moment with someone you suspected might have feelings for you. Did they let it die out naturally, or did they come back to address it? Did they seem unusually bothered by the idea that you might be upset with them, more bothered than the situation probably warranted? That disproportionate concern is not random. It's a signal, a real one, rooted in how much your emotional state has started to matter to their own sense of well-being. Let's shift into something a little deeper now, something that connects directly to the one sign I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, because everything we've talked about so far builds toward it. Psychologists who study emotional bonding have identified a pattern called protective attentiveness, and it's arguably the single most consistent behavioral marker across cultures, across age groups, and across relationship types when someone is falling in love. It shows up as an increased, almost involuntary awareness of another person's emotional and physical state. This isn't about grand romantic gestures. It's about the small, almost invisible check ins. Someone falling for you starts noticing when you seem off, even if you haven't said anything. They notice when your tone shifts slightly during a conversation. They notice when you seem tired or stressed or unusually quiet, and something in them feels compelled to ask about it, even if you're not particularly close in an obvious way. This happens because the brain, once it starts forming an attachment to someone, begins treating that person's well being as partially linked to its own. It's the same neurological mechanism that makes parents hyper attuned to their children's moods, scaled down into early romantic bonding. If you've ever had someone randomly text you asking if you're okay, with no clear trigger, no obvious reason for them to have noticed anything, that's this exact psychological pattern in action. Their attention has quietly expanded to include your emotional state as something worth monitoring, something worth caring about, even without a clear invitation to do so. This is the sign that shows up in almost every single case of a man falling in love, more consistently than gifts, more consistently than compliments, more consistently even than physical affection. It's the quiet, persistent noticing, the checking in, the subtle worry that creeps into their behavior when something seems even slightly wrong with you. It's easy to miss because it doesn't look like romance in the traditional sense. It looks like concern. It looks like care. But psychologically, that concern is often the earliest, most reliable indicator of deep emotional investment because it requires vulnerability, it requires attention, and it requires a level of emotional priority that people don't extend to just anyone. Now, let's talk about why this sign specifically tends to appear before someone is ready to say anything out loud. Fear plays a massive role in early romantic development, more than most people realize. The fear of rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain, according to research on social rejection and the brain. This means that admitting feelings, saying them directly, carries a genuine psychological risk that the brain tries to avoid until it feels reasonably safe to take that risk. But protective attentiveness doesn't require the same vulnerability as verbal confession. Checking in on someone, noticing their mood, asking if they're okay. These actions can be framed as simple kindness, as friendliness, as basic decency, which gives the person a socially safe way to express care without formally declaring anything. This is why so many people experience this sign long before any actual confession of feelings happens. It's the nervous system's way of expressing affection while keeping plausible deniability intact, a built in safety net in case the feelings aren't reciprocated. I want you to pause here for a second and really think about your own experiences because I guarantee almost everyone watching this has a memory of someone doing exactly this. Someone who reached out at an oddly specific moment. Someone who seemed to sense something was wrong without being told. Someone whose timing felt almost impossible to explain rationally. At the time, you might have brushed it off as coincidence or as them just being a naturally caring person. But if this behavior was specific to you, if it didn't happen the same way with other people in their life, that specificity is the key detail that separates general kindness from genuine emotional investment. Let's go deeper into the science behind why this specific pattern is so universal, because understanding the mechanism makes it much easier to recognize in real time instead of only in hindsight. Human attachment systems evolved primarily for survival, originally in the context of caregiver and infant bonding, but the same neurological wiring gets repurposed in adult romantic attachment. When someone becomes emotionally significant to another person, the brain begins allocating cognitive resources to monitoring that person's safety and well being, almost like an automatic background process running without conscious effort. This is why people who are falling in love often report thinking about the other person at seemingly random moments throughout the day, not because they're trying to, but because the brain has essentially added them to a mental watch list of things worth tracking. Protective attentiveness is the outward behavioral expression of this internal monitoring system. It's not calculated, it's not strategic. It's a byproduct of genuine emotional attachment forming beneath conscious awareness. Here's something that might surprise you. This sign tends to intensify specifically during moments when you're not actively seeking attention, when you're not performing, when you're simply existing in your normal state, tired, stressed, distracted, whatever it might be. That's actually significant because it means the interest isn't tied to a performance or an idealized version of you. It's tied to your authentic, unfiltered self. Someone noticing you and caring about you during your least polished moments is often a stronger indicator of real emotional investment than someone complimenting you during your best moments. Because anyone can appreciate someone who's putting effort into being impressive. It takes something deeper to notice and care during the moments when you're not trying to be impressive at all. Now let's talk about consistency because this is where a lot of people get confused and start second guessing what they're seeing. A single instance of someone checking in on you doesn't necessarily mean much on its own. People have good days where they're more attentive than usual, and that doesn't automatically translate into romantic feelings. The psychological weight of this sign comes from repetition, from it becoming a pattern rather than a one time occurrence. Ask yourself honestly, has this happened once or has it happened repeatedly across different situations over an extended period of time? Genuine emotional attachment shows up as a consistent behavioral shift, not an isolated incident. If someone only ever checks in on you when it's convenient for them, or only when they want something from you, that's a different pattern entirely, one rooted in self interest rather than genuine care. But if the check ins happen regardless of what they might gain from it, if they happen even when there's no clear benefit to them, that consistency is what elevates this from a possible coincidence to a genuine psychological signal. There's also a difference between generic checking in and specific checking in, and this distinction matters more than people realize. Generic check ins sound like "hope you're doing well," messages sent to everyone in a group chat, impersonal, low effort, requiring almost no thought. Specific check ins reference actual details from previous conversations. They ask about particular situations you mentioned. They follow up on things that happened days or even weeks earlier that you might have assumed they forgot about. This level of specificity requires genuine cognitive investment, meaning the person had to actually remember, actually think about you when you weren't present, actually care enough to bring it up again later. This is the version of protective attentiveness that carries the most psychological weight because it proves the noticing isn't automatic politeness, it's active, ongoing mental engagement with your life. I also want to address something important here because this sign, like any behavioral pattern, isn't foolproof on its own. And psychology is never about absolute certainty, it's about probability and pattern recognition. Some people are naturally more attentive and caring as part of their general personality, regardless of romantic feelings. This is why it's so important to compare behavior across different relationships in someone's life. Do they treat everyone this way? Or is this behavior noticeably different when it comes to you specifically? The contrast is what reveals the truth. If someone is generally warm and caring toward everyone equally, protective attentiveness toward you specifically isn't necessarily romantic. It might just be their personality. But if you can identify a clear behavioral gap, if they're more attentive toward you than toward others in similar situations, that gap is where the real psychological signal lives. Let's talk about timing for a moment because timing reveals intention in ways that words often can't. Pay attention to when these check ins happen. Do they happen right after you've mentioned something stressful, even in passing, even if you downplayed it at the time? Do they happen during moments when you'd expect someone to have completely forgotten what you said, days or weeks later? This kind of delayed but accurate follow up reveals something psychologically significant. It means you were on their mind even when you weren't physically present, which circles back to that internal monitoring system we talked about earlier. The brain doesn't allocate ongoing mental bandwidth to people it doesn't consider significant. If you're occupying space in someone's thoughts, even during moments of separation, that's a meaningful indicator of emotional investment. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. How does this pattern actually feel from your perspective when it happens to you? Does it feel intrusive or does it feel comforting? Genuine protective attentiveness, the kind rooted in real emotional connection, usually feels warm rather than overwhelming. It feels like being seen rather than being watched. There's a meaningful psychological difference between someone monitoring you out of controlling tendencies and someone noticing you out of genuine care. And the emotional tone of the behavior usually makes that distinction clear if you pay close attention to how it actually feels in the moment rather than just analyzing it from a distance. Let's bring in another layer of psychological insight here because there's a reason this particular sign tends to show up earlier and more reliably than verbal expressions of interest. Verbal declarations require certainty. They require someone to have processed their feelings enough to articulate them clearly, which takes time, self reflection, and courage. But behavioral patterns like protective attentiveness don't require that same level of processing. They emerge from the subconscious, from the emotional and instinctual parts of the brain that respond faster than the rational verbal parts. This is why someone can show clear signs of falling for another person weeks or even months before they're able to admit it, sometimes even before they're able to admit it to themselves. If you've ever had the experience of noticing someone's behavior shift before they ever said anything about how they felt, this is exactly why. Their subconscious was already responding to the emotional shift long before their conscious mind caught up. This actually explains a phenomenon a lot of people experience but rarely understand. The situation where someone seems to be developing feelings, shows all these subtle signs, and then suddenly seems to pull back or get distant. This isn't necessarily a sign that the feelings weren't real. In many cases, it's the conscious mind finally catching up to what the subconscious has been doing all along and reacting with fear. Once someone consciously realizes they've developed feelings, the vulnerability of that realization can trigger self protective withdrawal, especially in people who've been hurt before or who struggle with fear of rejection. This is where things get complicated psychologically because the very same person who was checking in on you constantly, noticing your moods, remembering small details, might suddenly seem to retreat once they become consciously aware of what those behaviors actually meant. Understanding this pattern can completely change how you interpret sudden shifts in someone's behavior because it's often not a sign of disinterest. It's a sign of internal conflict between wanting connection and fearing vulnerability. Let's talk about a related concept, something psychologists refer to as approach avoidance conflict because it directly ties into why falling in love often looks messier and more inconsistent than people expect. When someone genuinely cares about another person, two competing psychological forces activate simultaneously. The drive to get closer, rooted in genuine desire for connection, and the drive to protect themselves from potential emotional harm, rooted in self preservation instincts. This internal tug of war creates behavioral inconsistency that confuses a lot of people trying to read the situation. One day, someone seems incredibly present, attentive, warm, checking in constantly. The next day, they seem distant, harder to reach, more guarded. This isn't necessarily manipulation or mixed signals in the negative sense people often assume. It's often simply the visible outcome of someone's nervous system genuinely struggling to reconcile wanting closeness with fearing what that closeness might cost them emotionally if things don't work out. If you're someone who has experienced this kind of back and forth pattern with another person, warmth followed by distance, followed by warmth again, understanding this psychological mechanism might completely reframe how you see it. It doesn't excuse genuinely inconsistent or harmful treatment, and it's important to always prioritize your own emotional well being over trying to decode someone else's internal conflict. But recognizing this pattern for what it often is, an internal struggle rather than a lack of feelings, can provide clarity in situations that otherwise feel confusing and painful to navigate. Now, let's bring this back to something practical, something you can actually use. If you're trying to figure out whether someone is developing genuine feelings for you, stop looking for grand gestures and start looking for consistency in small moments. Look for whether their attention toward you specifically differs from how they treat other people in similar situations. Look for whether they remember small, seemingly unimportant details from past conversations. Look for whether they check in on your emotional state without an obvious external prompt to do so. Look for whether they attempt to repair tension or awkwardness rather than letting it linger unresolved. And most importantly, look for whether this noticing, this checking in, this protective attentiveness happens consistently over time rather than as an isolated occurrence. At the same time, it's worth acknowledging something important before we finish, something that often gets left out of content like this. Recognizing these signs isn't about becoming hyper analytical of every interaction to the point where you lose the ability to simply enjoy connecting with someone. Psychology gives us tools to understand human behavior more clearly, but relationships still require presence, communication, and genuine vulnerability from both sides eventually. These signs can help you understand what's happening beneath the surface, but at some point, real clarity comes from open, honest communication, not just careful observation from a distance. Behavioral analysis can point you in the right direction, but it can't replace the conversation that eventually needs to happen if you want real certainty about where things stand. It's also worth remembering that everyone processes emotional vulnerability differently, shaped by their own past experiences, attachment styles, and personal history. Someone with an anxious attachment style might show these signs more intensely and more visibly, almost unable to hide the depth of their noticing and concern. Someone with a more avoidant attachment style might show these same signs, but in a much more restrained, harder to detect way, still caring deeply, but expressing it with far more emotional distance and control. This is why context always matters more than any single checklist. The core psychological pattern, protective attentiveness, tends to hold true across attachment styles, but the intensity and visibility of that pattern can vary significantly depending on someone's individual emotional history and how safe they generally feel with vulnerability. As we wrap up here, I want you to think back to the very beginning of this video, back to that idea of unconscious synchronization the mirroring, the attention shifts, and now this deeper layer of protective attentiveness we've spent so much time unpacking. None of these signs exist in isolation. They build on each other, they reinforce each other, and together they paint a much clearer psychological picture than any single moment ever could on its own. Falling in love isn't a single dramatic event, it's a gradual accumulation of small, consistent behavioral shifts that reveal what someone might not yet be ready or able to say out loud. And once you understand the psychology behind these patterns, you start noticing them everywhere, in your own relationships, in the people around you, in moments you might have completely overlooked before. So here's what I want to leave you with. Think back through your own life right now. Think about someone whose behavior has ever puzzled you, someone who seemed to notice things about you that felt oddly specific, someone who checked in at moments that felt almost impossible to explain through simple coincidence. Now that you understand what protective attentiveness actually looks like and why it happens, does that change how you interpret what was really going on beneath the surface? I want to know, so tell me in the comments below. Have you experienced this exact sign with someone in your own life? And looking back now, what do you think it really meant